In 151 BC, Carthage paid the last of its war debt to Rome, 388 tons of silver, delivered on schedule. Every last talent accounted for, 50 years of payments, made without default, without a single missed installment. And 3 years later, Rome burned the city to the ground. Let that sink in. Carthage did not fall because it refused to pay. It did not fall because it rebuilt its army or launched a new invasion. It fell because it paid everything it owed, recovered its economy, and stopped being useful to the power that had been extracting from it for half a century. The moment the payments ended, so did Rome's reason to keep Carthage alive. This is not a story about war. It is a story about debt, about what happens when the terms of a peace treaty are written not to punish the loser, but to control it. About what happens when a creditor nation realizes that a solvent debtor is more valuable than a destroyed one. And about what happens when that debtor finally clears its balance sheet. Here is what most people do not understand about the fall of Carthage. Rome had every opportunity to destroy it in 211 BC, after defeating Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. The Roman general Scipio Africanus chose not to. He imposed a peace treaty instead. 10,000 silver talents. 50 years. 200 talents per year. A fleet reduced to 10 warships. No war without Roman permission. It looked like mercy. It was not mercy. It was a revenue structure. For 50 years Carthage paid. It rebuilt. It traded. Its harbors filled with ships from across the Mediterranean. Every year, 200 talents of silver crossed the sea to Rome. Debt was the chain. Compliance was the price of survival. And then Carthage paid it off. Why would Rome wait 50 years to destroy a city it could have destroyed at any moment? The answer has nothing to do with military strategy. It has everything to do with money. What country in your lifetime has been told, pay the debt, comply with the terms, and you will be left in peace? Leave your answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, you will recognize it immediately. To understand what Rome did to Carthage, you need to understand what Carthage was. Not the defeated city of 201 BC, not the rubble of 146 BC, the Carthage that existed before the wars began. Because the scale of what was taken from it only makes sense when you know what it had. Carthage was founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now northern Tunisia, somewhere around 814 BC. For 5 centuries it grew. It built trade networks that stretched from the western coast of Africa to the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain. Its merchants sailed routes that no other civilization in the ancient world had charted. Its navy was the most powerful in the Mediterranean. Its population, at the height of its power, may have reached 800,000 people. The same size, ancient sources tell us, as Rome itself. It was not a military empire in the Roman sense. Rome conquered territory. Carthage monetized it. Where Rome planted legions, Carthage planted trading posts. Where Rome demanded tribute, Carthage negotiated contracts. The Carthaginian model was commercial. Revenue came from trade routes, silver mines in Spain and North Africa, agricultural surplus, and the management of port access across the western Mediterranean. Carthage did not need to occupy a city to profit from it. It needed to be the city that everyone else had to trade through. That model made it extraordinarily wealthy, and it made it extraordinarily threatening to Rome. First of the three wars began in 264 BC, over the island of Sicily. Rome was expanding south and west. Carthage had long established interests in the western half of the island. The collision was almost inevitable. What was not inevitable was how long it would take, or how much it would cost both sides. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. When it ended in 241 BC, Carthage had lost Sicily, its naval supremacy, and approximately 82,000 kilograms of silver. The Treaty of Lutatius imposed 3,200 talents over 10 years. It was a significant sum. It was not a killing blow. Carthage was a rich city, with functioning trade routes and direct access to the silver mines of Spain and North Africa. It paid. It paid on time. It even paid early. But the treaty did something else. It stripped Carthage of Sicily permanently. The most productive western territory it held was gone. The revenue that island generated, gone. And then, 6 years later, in 237 BC, while Carthage was fighting a brutal civil war against its own unpaid mercenaries, Rome moved again. Roman forces occupied Sardinia. Sardinia was Carthaginian territory. Rome had no legal claim to it. When Carthage protested, the Roman response was direct. Pay an additional 1,200 talents. Surrender Corsica as well, or we will declare war immediately. Carthage had spent 3 years suppressing a mercenary rebellion. Its treasury was under strain. Its army was exhausted. It paid. Mark that moment, because 237 BC is not a footnote. It is the template. Rome had just demonstrated that it could manufacture a legal pretext, threaten force, and extract additional wealth from Carthage at will. And Carthage had just demonstrated that it would comply rather than fight. That dynamic, creditor threatening, debtor paying, would define the next 90 years of Mediterranean history. Here is the part nobody tells you. The peace terms Rome imposed on Carthage after the Second Punic War in 201 BC were not designed to destroy it. They were designed to preserve it at a specific size, with a specific level of wealth. Just enough to keep paying, not enough to ever threaten again. This distinction matters more than anything else in this story. When Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Rome held total military supremacy over Carthage. Its navy was broken. Its armies were shattered. Its Spanish silver mines had already fallen to Roman forces years before the final battle. There was nothing, not a single warship, not a single legion, preventing Rome from marching into the city of Carthage itself and ending it in 201 BC. Scipio chose not to. He chose instead to write a treaty, and the structure of that treaty reveals exactly what Rome intended. 10,000 silver talents, payable over 50 years. That is 200 talents per year. Not 500, not 1,000, not by 200. A rate carefully calibrated to be sustainable for a city of Carthage's commercial capacity. The Romans, and specifically Scipio, understood Carthage's economy well enough to know how much it could pay indefinitely without collapsing. That number was not chosen arbitrarily. It was chosen by creditors, who needed reliable annual installments from a debtor that would survive long enough to deliver them all. The fleet was reduced to 10 warships, enough for coastal patrol, not enough for Mediterranean projection. Carthage could protect its own harbor mouth. It could not threaten anyone else's coastline. Carthage was forbidden from waging war anywhere outside Africa without Rome's explicit written permission. Inside Africa it could act, but only with Roman approval. In practice, this meant that Carthage could not defend itself against its neighbors without first asking the permission of the very power that was systematically allowing those neighbors to encroach on its territory. Pay attention to this number. 50 years. That is a full human lifetime. A child born in Carthage, the year the treaty was signed, would be 50 years old before the final payment was due. 2 generations of Carthaginians would grow up knowing their city existed under permanent financial obligation to a foreign power. 2 generations would absorb the political reality that sovereignty was conditional. That autonomy had a price, and that price was 200 talents of silver every single year, without negotiation and without exception. The treaty also required Carthage to surrender named hostages to Rome, the sons of its ruling families, held in the capital of the creditor state, as living collateral. If Carthage defaulted or violated any term, those hostages were forfeit. The debt was backed not just by the threat of military force, but by the bodies of Carthage's own children. This is what structured subjugation looks like in the ancient world. It is not a boot on the neck. It is a contract, not formalized, permanent, or enforceable, with embedded consequences for non-compliance and no mechanism, none for renegotiation. And yet, what happened next was not supposed to happen. Hannibal came home. Defeated at Zama, stripped of his army, his Spanish empire gone, Hannibal Barca returned to Carthage and entered politics. In 196 BC, he was elected suffect, the chief magistrate of the city, and he did something that no Roman strategist had planned for. Fixed Carthage's finances. He audited the public accounts. He discovered that Carthaginian nobles had been diverting public revenues into private pockets for decades. Reformed the tax collection system from the ground up. He identified new revenue from Carthage's agricultural lands and its remaining trade networks. And within a few years, Carthage was not merely surviving its debt obligations. It was thriving despite them. Its harbors were full. Its grain was feeding cities across the Mediterranean. Polybius, writing in the generation that watched Carthage burn, recorded it as the wealthiest city in the world. Rome took notice. Rome was not pleased. But it gets worse, because Carthage's recovery did not happen in silence. It happened in full view of Rome, and Rome responded to every sign of Carthaginian economic strength with another instrument of control. The mechanism was Numidia. Numidia was the kingdom to the west and south of Carthage. Its king, Massinissa, had fought alongside Rome against Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. In exchange for that loyalty, Rome made Numidia its regional ally and its regional enforcer. Over the following decades, Massinissa raided Carthaginian territory repeatedly. He seized farmland. He occupied towns. He pushed Carthage's borders inward, year by year, stripping away the agricultural land that Carthage needed to generate the surplus that funded the debt payments. And Carthage could not respond. The Treaty of 201 BC was explicit. No war without Rome's permission. Every time Carthage appealed to Rome to intervene against Numidian raids, Rome arbitrated, and the arbitration consistently favored Massinissa. Every time Carthage attempted to defend its own territory militarily, Rome reminded it that any military action required Roman approval. The debt clause and the war clause worked together. One extracted Carthage's wealth. The other prevented it from protecting the sources of that wealth. This is where the anger should land. Not at a battle, not at a general, at a system, at the deliberate, documented use of treaty terms. To keep a recovering nation permanently exposed to predation, it was contractually forbidden from resisting. In 157 BC, a Roman senatorial delegation arrived in Carthage to mediate the latest border dispute with Massinissa. One member of that delegation was Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Elder, 82 years old. Veteran of the Second Punic War who had watched Roman soldiers die in Italy during Hannibal's invasion 40 years earlier. Cato walked through the streets of Carthage and saw something that changed the political trajectory of the ancient world. He saw a rich city. Polybius records that by this period, Carthage was the wealthiest city on earth. Its double harbor, rebuilt by Hannibal's tax reforms decades earlier, was full of merchant ships from across the Mediterranean. Its market quarter was active. Its walls were formidable. Its grain, its olive oil, its textiles moved through the known world. Cato saw all of this. When he returned to Rome, he began ending every speech he made in the Roman Senate, on every subject, about every matter, with the same 5 words. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Not because Carthage was a military threat. The treaty had ensured it was not. 10 warships. No standing army outside Africa. 50 years of enforced disarmament. Carthage posed no military danger to anyone. What Cato saw in those harbor streets was something that frightened Rome far more than a legion. He saw a competitor, an economic competitor. A city that had absorbed 2 generations of debt, complied with every military restriction, and still managed to become the richest trading hub in the Mediterranean. A city that was still paying its installments to Rome, while simultaneously outgrowing Rome's ability to control it commercially. Cato understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his career watching power operate, what that meant. Carthage rich and bound was manageable. Carthage rich and free, free of the debt, free to rearm if it chose, free to compete without restriction, was a different problem entirely. In 151 BC, Carthage made its final payment. 3 years of Roman senatorial debate followed. Otto was dead by then. He died in 149 BC, just after war was declared, reportedly satisfied that this time the destruction would happen on Carthaginian soil, not Italian. But his argument had won. Rome found its pretext in that same year, 149 BC. Carthage had raised a force of 31,000 soldiers to repel a Numidian invasion. A Numidian invasion Rome had done nothing to prevent. That, Rome declared, was an act of war. This is where the story changes. Because what Rome did to Carthage was not a one-time event in the ancient world. It was a replicable system. The man who first named it as a system was not an ancient historian. He was a 20th century economist sitting in the wreckage of a different war. His name was John Maynard Keynes. In 1919, Keynes was the principal representative of the British Treasury at the Paris Peace Conference. Watched the Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States, negotiate the terms of Germany's defeat in the First World War. and what he saw alarmed him enough that he resigned his position and wrote one of the most important economic documents of the 20th century. Called it The Economic Consequences of the Peace. The argument Keynes made in that book is precise. The reparations imposed on Germany at Versailles in 1919, 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of roughly 33 billion US dollars in 1921 values, were not designed to compensate the Allies for their losses. They were designed, Keynes argued, to permanently cripple Germany's industrial capacity, to extract its wealth while preventing its recovery, to keep it solvent enough to keep paying, but too weak to compete. Keynes did not reach for a modern comparison. He reached back 2,000 years. He called it a Carthaginian peace. That phrase, Carthaginian peace, entered the vocabulary of international economics at that moment. It means a peace designed not to settle a conflict, but to perpetuate the victor's advantage through financial obligation. A peace in which the terms of surrender are written by the creditor for the benefit of the creditor, with the losing nation's compliance enforced not by ongoing military occupation, but by the structure of the debt itself. Germany paid reparations, or tried to. The payments triggered inflation, economic collapse, political instability, and ultimately produced the conditions in which the Second World War became possible. The debt that was supposed to make Germany permanently weak made it, eventually, violently desperate. Keynes had predicted exactly this. Rome's pattern, reproduced in 1919, produced the same structural outcome, not immediately, but with the same logic. A creditor nation that extracts too much, too long, from a debtor it has simultaneously disarmed and surrounded, eventually produces a crisis it cannot contain. Now move forward again, to the second half of the 20th century. The International Monetary Fund was founded in 1944. Its stated purpose was financial stability, a lender of last resort for nations in economic crisis. What emerged in practice, particularly from the 1970s onward, was a lending structure that critics across the political spectrum, from the left and the right, identified as structurally similar to what Rome had imposed on Carthage. A nation in crisis borrows from the IMF. The loan comes with conditions: structural adjustment, privatization of state assets, reduction of public spending, currency devaluation, export-oriented restructuring of the domestic economy. The nation repays the loan. The conditions remain. And the economic architecture that was dismantled to meet those conditions, the domestic industries, the subsidized agriculture, the protected manufacturers, does not return when the debt is cleared. The creditor's commercial interests, meanwhile, have been embedded in the debtor's economy for the duration of the lending period. Argentina, Greece, Nobby, Zambia, Indonesia, each went through this process at different points in the second half of the 20th century. Each recovered, partially. Each found that recovery triggered a new cycle of external pressure, rather than a recognition of freedom from obligation. You do not need to agree with every critique of the IMF to see the structural logic. Debt, written by the creditor, enforced by the creditor, with terms that tie the debtor's sovereignty to the creditor's approval. This is not a modern invention. It has a name. Keynes gave it one, and the city it was named after was destroyed in 146 BC. is what most people miss. The destruction of Carthage was not a military decision, and it was a financial one, and the proof is in the timing. Carthage made its final indemnity payment in 151 BC. 1 year later, in 150 BC, the Roman Senate began its deliberations about war. 3 years after the last payment, in 149 BC, Rome declared it. The sequence is not coincidental. The sequence is the story. For 50 years, Rome had collected 200 talents of silver from Carthage every single year. That revenue stream funded Roman infrastructure, Roman military campaigns in Macedonia and Greece, Roman political operations across the Mediterranean. Carthage was not just a defeated enemy. It was a productive asset. You do not liquidate a productive asset while it is still generating returns. But the moment Carthage cleared its debt, the calculus changed. A Carthage that owed nothing was a Carthage that owed Rome nothing. It was free to rearm legally once the 50-year prohibition on its fleet expired. It was free to negotiate its own trade terms with the same Mediterranean partners that Rome traded with. It was free to compete. It was already competing successfully. Its grain exports, its harbor activity, its commercial networks had recovered to the point where Polybius recorded it as the wealthiest city in the world. The debt had been the mechanism of control. The moment the debt ended, the control ended. And Rome, faced with a choice between accepting a rival or eliminating one, made the choice that empires consistently make. This is the deeper truth that the Carthage story forces you to confront. Debt, in the hands of a powerful enough creditor, is not a financial instrument. It is a political one. Does not measure what you owe. It measures how much autonomy you are permitted to exercise. You are sovereign to the extent that your creditor allows you to be sovereign. No further. Cato the Elder understood this intuitively. His famous phrase, Carthago delenda est, was not irrational hatred, though it was dressed in the language of fear. It was a precise political calculation. A Carthage under debt was a controlled Carthage. A Carthage debt-free and growing rich was, in Cato's analysis, a Carthage that would eventually demand to be treated as an equal. And Rome did not negotiate with equals. It absorbed them, or it destroyed them. There is a secondary truth buried in this story that is even more uncomfortable. The debt terms that Scipio imposed in 201 BC were lenient enough to be payable. That was not an accident of generosity. It was engineering. Rome had seen what happened when you broke a debtor entirely. In the mercenary wars that followed the First Punic War, Carthage had been so financially strained that its own hired soldiers had revolted. Broken debtor produces chaos. A manageable debtor produces revenue. Scipio calibrated 200 talents per year, specifically because that number was survivable. The cruelty was not in the amount. The cruelty was in the duration. 50 years of survivable extraction is not compassion. It is optimization. And when Hannibal's tax reforms made Carthage more than merely survive, when they made it thrive, Rome did not celebrate the efficiency of its debtor. Rome grew alarmed at the ambition of a city that had proven it could operate outside Roman assumptions about what a defeated nation was permitted to become. The lesson the ancient world recorded, and that every empire since has quietly understood, is this: a creditor does not fear a debtor that cannot pay. It fears a debtor that no longer needs to. This is where it becomes personal. Because you live in a world built by creditors. Not the ancient kind with silver talents and war galleys. The modern kind with bond markets, credit ratings, and international lending conditions. But the architecture is the same. And if you understand what happened to Carthage, you will never read a debt headline the same way again. Think about what debt does to a nation's choices. When your government owes money to external creditors, those creditors have a claim on your future decisions, not on your past productivity and your future choices. The interest rate your country pays on its bonds is not just a financial figure. It measures how much political latitude your government has to act without creditor approval. A country with low debt and high reserves can raise public spending, protect domestic industries, and ignore IMF advice. A country with high debt and shrinking reserves cannot, must comply. The language has changed. It is called conditionality now, not indemnity, but the structure is identical. You have watched this play out in your lifetime, even if you did not have the framework to name it. You watched Greece in 2010, a country whose debt reached 179% of its gross domestic product. The bailout terms included pension cuts, public sector wage reductions, the privatization of ports, airports, and public utilities. Greek voters elected governments that campaigned against austerity. Those governments implemented austerity anyway, because the creditors, the European Central Bank, the IMF, the German government, held the debt. And the debt held the choices. You watched Argentina, which defaulted on its debt in 2001, restructured, borrowed again, defaulted again in 2014, restructured again. A country that has spent 3 decades inside a cycle of debt-driven compliance, from which it has not escaped. Now ask yourself the harder question. What does this mean for you directly? Your national currency, your pension, the price of food in your country. All of these are shaped by your government's debt position, by the confidence of its creditors, and by the conditions those creditors attach to the capital your government borrows. You did not negotiate those conditions. You were born into an economy carrying obligations incurred before you were old enough to understand what a bond yield means. Carthage did not choose the terms of 201 BC. Its citizens did not vote on the 50-year payment schedule. They complied with it. And the last installment was finally paid when they believed at last that the obligation was discharged. The city was destroyed anyway. The debt was never about what Carthage owed. It was about what Rome could extract. And the moment extraction ended, so did tolerance. Let us return to where we began. In 151 BC, Carthage paid the last of its war debt to Rome, 388 tons of silver. Every installment, every year, every talent. And 3 years later, Rome declared war. By 146 BC, the city was burning. Up to 750,000 people were dead. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The buildings still standing after 17 days of fire were demolished stone by stone. Rome sent a second team back after the war to destroy what the fire had not. Carthage had done everything a defeated nation was supposed to do. It paid, not it complied. It disarmed. It rebuilt within the boundaries its creditor permitted. And its reward, at the end of 50 years of compliance, was annihilation. Here is what that tells you. Creditor does not free a compliant debtor. A creditor frees a debtor that is no longer worth controlling. Those are two very different things. Carthage was destroyed not because it failed. It was destroyed because it succeeded too visibly, cleared its obligations too completely, and became too independent too quickly for Rome to absorb commercially. John Maynard Keynes named this pattern in 1919. He watched the Allies impose it on Germany and predicted the consequences precisely. The Second World War followed 17 years after the treaty Keynes resigned in protest of. The Carthaginian peace he warned about produced, as it always produces, a crisis the creditor could not contain. The pattern is not history. It is a technology. Developed in the ancient Mediterranean, refined in the treaty rooms of modern Europe, running today in the bond markets and lending institutions of your world. You see it when a nation clears its IMF obligations and immediately faces new pressure. You see it when the rules governing what a debtor may do are written exclusively by those it owes money to. Debt is not a neutral instrument. In the hands of the powerful, it is a claim on the future of the less powerful. It always has been. The silver that left Carthage every year for 50 years did not buy Rome's goodwill. It bought 50 years of delay. History does not repeat. But if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same. Subscribe and leave your answer below. Which country in your lifetime paid everything it owed and lost everything anyway?